What would it take to completely transform your business? Now, you might be surprised to find out that you really only need 1 hour to take your business from good to great. We're talking about giving you back your time and running a more efficient, effective business. On today's show, we have Kris Ward on the podcast. She's the host of the Win the Hour, Win the Day podcast herself, an incredible show you need to go check out. And her business at winthehourwintheday.com is all about giving you back time in your day. We're talking about running an effective, efficient business and using a system that actually works. I love today's episode. If you've ever felt like your business is running you, you're going to want to tune into today's show. Now, before we dive in, we do have a word for one of the amazing businesses that sponsors the podcast. And as well, if you ever thought about supporting the show, you can always reach out, Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com, or you can visit our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. And we appreciate all of those who support the show. Let's dive into it. We'll be back soon. Life is constantly moving quickly. And in fact, I find myself more and more wanting a pause button to capture some of those special memories with my family. That's why I love what the team at Duncan & Stone is doing. They've created high-quality keepsake journals for every stage of life. From people who are freshly engaged all the way to welcoming their first child, Duncan & Stone has a series of journals that are incredible for capturing some of those precious memories, and not just memories, with the stories and conversations that you want to have with your loved ones one day. Personally, I love the Dear Daughter Journal because it captures all of the amazing memories that I want to be able to tell my daughter Maylee one day. The team at Duncan & Stone understands the value of keeping these memories close to home. That's why they've spared no expense in creating high-quality journals that are designed in-house because they know how precious these memories are. Check out duncanandstone.com and see some of the journals that will walk you through every stage of life. They're easy to use and beautiful to display, and most importantly, they capture what matters. Again, go to duncanandstone.com to find out more. Kris, it is so great to have you on the podcast.
I am pumped to be here, Blake.
And I owe you an apology. For people who listen to the show long term, my listeners know I try to be fairly genuine and get back with people. But Kris, I owe you an apology because I was sending you a message because you had posted like a sales scam kind of thing that had happened. And again, listeners on the show, they know I kind of rant about these things often. Well, so you had posted about this little kind of, it wasn't really a scam, but it was like a sales funnel that was not very totally straightforward. Well,
that I got caught up in. Exactly. I wasn't producing it. I got caught up in it.
Yes, yeah. right. I was giving you saying stop. No. So for our listeners, Kris was posting about, and we've all been there, where you get into this sales pipeline you didn't expect to get into, and you're like, wait, I'm being sold to. So Kris posted about this. I DM'd Kris. Kris and I, to my knowledge, have never spoken before or had much of a conversation. So I DM'd Kris to be like, hey, I love that you posted this. And then I realized you had actually reached out to me with a personal video that was like, hey, Blake. And I was like, wow, this was like months ago and I never got back to you. But here we are, alas. So thank you for being so gracious to still come on my podcast. And I'm very excited for our conversation today.
Me too. I can't wait.
So you are a business coach. I've seen a couple of your things. Actually, I got your networking. It's almost like a Excel CRM tool in its own right. So I got your Excel sheet. I checked out your podcast. So for our listeners, what the heck you're doing? Click pause on this podcast. Go check out Kris's podcast. As of this episode that we're recording now, Kris, 237 episodes. It's called Win the Hour, Win the Day podcast. The listeners have heard a little bit of an intro about you. You are doing a lot of amazing stuff. Give us the spiel. Who is Kris Ward, and tell us a little bit about your business.
Okay, that's a great question, because so often people just think, oh, I help entrepreneurs get their time back and get out of their own way. And to the basic listener, that sounds like an annoying person who's organized and going to try to organize you. And that is not the case. So What happened was I started my business 14 plus years ago, and I started out doing market messaging. And the first couple of years I was in business, I worked insane hours. My husband said I was always stealing from sleep, getting up earlier and earlier and
Hmm.
staying later and later.
Yeah.
And he told me about the 2-year mark that I was starting to lose my charm. It's like 2 years without sleep and you get a little edgy. So
Yeah, I
I was
think.
like, this,
Well, I was just to
yeah,
say, my spouse went through something similar of like, we're doing this. And then it got to a point where she was like, this is not as fun as I
no, as
had.
I thought.
Yeah.
So So I literally was like, oh my gosh, he's my biggest fan. We cannot have this. Everyone's supporting me in this business. So I was like, okay, enough. So I literally went from 16 hours a day down to 6. Now, that did not happen overnight. That's a whole story on its own, but let me move this story forward. Luckily, I did that because it was a couple years after that that my husband was diagnosed with cancer, colon cancer, and I was pulled away from the business for about 2 years.
Wow.
When I returned after his passing, my existing clients had no idea of my absence. It was just not how we navigate his journey. We were very positive in nature. And so they started to come to me and say, how could we have possibly not known? And if you could do that, maybe you could help me get to my kids' soccer games and things like that. So I started working with them under that capacity. And I realized really quickly that so many of them looked good on paper. They'd been in business 5, 10 years. They had these accolades, but they were working way too many hours for where they were at this point in their journey. And so we started to work within what we called their team, their time, and their toolkits. And my clients tell me all the time they get 25 hours back a week within the first month of working with us. And it's just all under the guise that your business should support your life, not consume it.
Those are fighting words for our listeners who there's many an entrepreneur listening right now who their identity is their business. So what you're talking about, I'm sure many people have perked up and are listening a little bit more closely now. When did the podcast come about?
Podcast came, I guess 4 years ago now. Yeah. So in the podcast, the Win the Hour, Win the Day podcast, we cover anything from sales to social media. So it's really just a tool for me to meet amazing people and to interview them and expand my network. It's not about efficiency, productivity, or getting yourself out of your way for your business. Cause I just found that sadly, most of the people that need my help, because they're so capable and smart and they're the go-to person for almost everyone in their lives, they think, oh, I just have to reorganize. I just have to work a little harder once I get past this next thing. And so they think it's character flaws that I just got to buckle down, right? I got to do all
Mm.
these things. And they always think, oh, it's the holidays, it's this, it's that. Once we get that new client on, once we get the website fixed, things will be different. And so I just felt that is not the podcast, me talking about this type of thing would not be heard. So I just, wanted to meet amazing people. And so we started the podcast really as a networking tool.
Yeah, I saw you had Richard Moore on the podcast.
Yes.
I really enjoy his sales content.
He is enjoyable. That's for sure.
But it's a huge testament to you because many people say, like, oh, I have a podcast. And then they had 6 episodes like 4 years ago, and in your case, you are an actual podcaster, which I think's worth saying, only because you have like people who podcast and then you have like the actual people who are devoting time and energy to that. And like I mentioned earlier in this episode, 237 episodes. So I think that alone is proof in the pudding that you know what you're talking about because you're running a business and you're podcasting regularly. So you've obviously figured something out from like a productivity side of things, and you're active on social media.
I am.
You are, doing a great job there as well. So tell me a little bit more about like, was this something that you like kind of, you were already doing it and like you worked backwards and you were like, oh, like this is why, like, was it sort of like discovering your own genius, or was it more of like something's broken and I need to figure out how to fix it?
Oh, so many good questions. Okay, let me start at the top. That podcast that you are highlighting, I think it's, that's a really good point. People don't usually bring that up. I mean, there's something like a 97% failure rate of people that don't get past 3 weeks.
It's a
And
lot.
here's the thing. Yeah. Here's the thing. What happens is people have this false sense. You put the podcast out, you're going to get all these listeners and it's another, advertising stream, that's just the wrong way to go into it. So what I would tell you is the average podcaster spends anywhere between 6 and 8 hours a week dealing with that processing, not the interview, but all the processing and the mayhem that goes behind that. We have actually had podcast production companies come through our program and where they're dealing with hundreds of podcasts, right? Using what we have, our super toolkits. I will touch on that in a moment. So what I would tell you is it takes my team using our super toolkit about an hour and 20 minutes to process a show. It takes me 6 minutes to do my part. So this is the whole foundation of everything I talk about, that you will always want to do something else. If you write a book, that's great. Now you got to promote the book, or you have to do a second book, or maybe you want to start a podcast. So you need the bandwidth on your calendar to constantly compress so you can get to the next thing that the last thing created, right? So that is huge. Now, to your point, Blake, no, as I told you, I was working insane hours. I bought into the philosophy that grinding it out, like if you're just working so hard and you're going so fast and you're so busy that it has to sort itself out. And then I had the false sense that speed was my superpower. I have worked with many entrepreneurs now, and I find that they fall into one of 5 categories. I myself am a recovering rushaholic. If you want to know what you are, check out our quiz at Free Gift from Kris, free GIFT from Kris, KRIS.com. And you'll find out what your superpower is, but also how it has some weaknesses and how you have to navigate around it, right? So for me as a rushaholic, I thought my mighty to-do list in my hand, get out of my way, I can go fast, I move quickly, I can get it all done, was really the backbone to getting that business off the ground. And it was shocking to me when I finally regrouped and started looking at things differently and understanding some basic fundamentals. And we boil down to your team, your time, and your toolkits. And so I would say this, and we can dive into any area you want to deeper, Blake. I would say, here's some big things. First of all, a team is a philosophy, not a number. So you can have one virtual assistant and that be a team when set up correctly. Most of us have had some experience in the corporate world, and it's a very parentified formula. Your manager, supervisor checks your work, delegates to you. It's very demanding on their time.
I love that language, by the way. I typically say parental, but I like parentified. That's an excellent way to put it.
Yeah. So that's why it doesn't work when you think, oh, I need to have somebody. And then all of a sudden that takes more work on your behalf because you're checking on them like a child or a student, right? And delegating means the work has to still come through you, which is extra work. So that's a problem, right? And then the other thing is SOPs. I can't be the only one to have gotten a job and you're sitting there on that first day and they throw a manual at you and you think, I'm going to lose this job because I can't stay awake. And then you go to use them later and it doesn't work. Standard operating procedures are usually not written by the end user, static in nature, and there to cover liability, and often have training mixed in amongst them to muddle it even more. So we have our signature super toolkit program, and what they are is dynamic documents that constantly improve in efficiency. And the difference between them and SOPs is the language, the clarity, and the ease of use. So these are some fundamentals, just even team and toolkits that nobody talks about. And then you keep thinking, I just have to go harder and faster. I'm almost there. And then how many cycles of burnout and how much is it costing your business? That's the sad thing is many of my clients, not only when they decrease their hours, is there better quality of living and they're more creative and their output increases, but they're making more money in way less time. So this running yourself into the ground is counterproductive and financially restrictive.
Yeah, I think about, I had hired someone to help me with my podcast and the hire didn't work out. I was spending so many hours trying to retrain this person. Who was a fantastic person, fantastic professional. It was probably more of a reflection on me not training her well than anything else. But finally, when she moved on, when I had to let her go, it was, I need to figure out a process for this instead of just brute forcing podcasts. Now, I don't have it down to 6 minutes. It takes me about probably 15 minutes an episode. But for my show, and then with my business Podcastable, we do quite a bit of work for our customers' podcasts. But something I really like about your story, I love how tangible your um your offer, for lack of a better phrase, is. But like you're talking about the actual products, the actual things you offer people. And it's something that I think is worth mentioning because in like the business coach space, there is sort of like this, and I think obviously you know this being in the space, but for our listeners, there's a lot of ambiguity around, oh, I'm a business coach. And like, well, what is that? And like, what do you do? Or like, what do you offer? And something that I typically give as advice to people who are hiring business coaches is, hey, what tangibly are they offering? That's kind of how you separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit. So hearing you talk about these things, it's like, okay, Kris has really nailed this and figured this out. Which, I don't know how fast this came about. I know you mentioned the passing of your husband and that timeline. But you've been in business 14 years, so you've probably seen quite a bit in the coaching space, even probably in the last few years. Which not a specific question there, but it's pretty interesting to think about, I guess.
It is interesting because I remember, I don't know if it's just not the people I hang out with anymore, but there was a period of time where you'd have people that came in to be a business coach who was starting a business. So how are you you're going to coach me and my business is, I'm not, time also doesn't solve all wounds in business. So you can't just say, because I've been in business 10 years and you've been in
Yeah.
5, I'm better at it. So that
Yeah.
also, it's like performing, it's like being an athlete. You're as good as your last race and your last month of sales and whatever. But I do find you are right. I've never had this discussion before on a show, but there's a lot of ambiguity. We'll write that word down since I can't say it. About, I'm just sort of, again, it's parentified. I'm going to help you. And then and a lot of it is really accountability or cheering somebody on.
Yeah.
I've never needed that, nor do my clients. I don't need to be cheered on. I need to be slowed down.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing is people will say to me, well, Kris, I'm so busy. How much time is this going to take? I'm like, well, you get time back and it's so customized. It's kind of like if I walked into your kitchen, Blake, and you were cooking, I'm just going to help you with the knife skills because you're already cooking and we're just going to speed that up.
Yeah.
And we also have, when we do find to hire and train a virtual assistant, we're not an agency, but we do that for our clients because we don't want them to experience a learning curve. So we'll get them a virtual assistant and then we'll train and onboard them, and we work with you and we work with them, and they go through our learning center and they go through our leadership program. Because you're right, it is a lot. In one hand, it's on you not having processes, but also we've not been educated or taught properly this leadership component, because leadership usually lends itself to the fact that if I'm a good leader, I can influence others to do as I want. When in fact, we want your team, again, it could be one person, to have such strong leadership skills that when you two are in a little mini scrum meeting, we call them, that you can't really tell who's in charge because you're really collaborating. I mean, I'm so excited when I meet with my team. I feel like these are my peers. And that frankly, I tease them all the time. If we had a board of directors, I might be out because they are all now smarter than me.
I think
there's a lot of power to it.
That's an ego check. I think, because I think the old way of doing leadership is very ego driven, and I'm the boss, I make it happen. And like you said, it's parentified. It's I'm the parent, but it's fun too because I think the way you do it, you're really encouraging. It's like when you give people permission to take initiative and maybe break something along the way. It's kind of exciting to see like what they can come up with. I had a great mentor who talked about allowing your team members to break things. Just don't let them break like the one thing. So like having like somewhat of a guardrail there, like maybe you don't give them access to like spend everything out of the corporate account, but there's other ways to encourage them to take charge and take initiative, which again, I think that's an ego check for a lot of bosses out there.
Well, with us in the super toolkits, it really just allows you're always queuing them, creating, using, and editing them, CUE. And what happens is, because they're always dynamic documents, we're building on your strengths. So they just constantly get more efficient. So here's the thing, is things don't really get broken because you have these super toolkits and let's say, I don't know, let's say I'm doing LinkedIn Lives, and then I have a super toolkit for that. And then all of a sudden, like next week, we say, hey, people really love to have whatever, a tangible takeaway or a PDF. Let's add that to the super toolkit. So then we're always just looking at, hey, does this work? Does that work? We're always editing it. Kind of like a couple of years ago when the lockdowns were coming out, all of a sudden, right before Christmas, somebody who had worked with me for a couple of years, she had applied years before to go from the Philippines to, as an international student to Canada as a student, right? And so she found out like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this I applied for this 3 years ago. This is before I worked with you. Now I got accepted. I've got like 6 days to go from the Philippines to Canada. And I was like, okay. Now I will tell you, she wanted to stay on with us because that's what happens. The loyalty is there because the job gives them so much creative freedom and they
Yeah.
enjoy it so much and they feel so valued. But I said, that's not realistic. So we posted an ad and we do have a 90% retention rate for people we hire for ourselves and our clients. And I brought Maura on. Now, this is a week before Christmas. We hand Maura the super toolkits. I met with her on January 4th and Maura is up to 80% capacity because everything's there. Think
Mhm.
of it like a carpenter. I'm not teaching her how to be a carpenter, but I'm saying here's the specs for everything we do.
Yeah.
Right. So when you have these super toolkits, life happens, things happen, people leave jobs or you want to get them promoted or, there's interruptions in your schedule. And it's not about getting past this next thing because to me, when people say that all the time, oh, Kris, you don't understand, this is happening right now, or we're launching this or we're doing that. And once I get past this, which by the way, ding, 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 that's an alarm.
Yeah.
What I would say is that's kind of like having a car that only drives in good weather. You have to be able to have a car that can handle the sleet, the snow, the rain. Otherwise, what good is it? And so that's my whole thing on business too is you should have a stable ride at all times and constantly be looking at getting your next idea to execution because that's what it's all about being an entrepreneur.
And Kris, I think I think your sales acumen is very clear in that you obviously know the benefit of what you're selling, which sounds a little silly. Like you think everyone would be that, but that's not always the case. But you're obviously very passionate about what you're selling. I'm curious, are you a lifelong salesperson, or did you have to learn
No.
how to sell?
No, I believe in what I'm talking about, so I don't even know if that falls into
No,
sales
I
like
think it
everybody
does.
else.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think that's a great thing that and this is something that I try to coach people on when we talk about sales is understanding like when it is your area of passion. Like I was on a sales call probably like 3 or 4 months ago, ended up being an incredibly lucrative, like very good for my bottom line kind of customer, and we were just talking about podcasting. And he goes, man, you're saying all the right things. And I was like, all I'm saying is what I love about podcasting. So
Yeah.
I think your point is a great one in that, you're obviously very passionate about this, which makes selling a lot easier when that's the case.
Well, because here's the thing, two stories I want to tell you really quickly. One is take the emotion out of my story. If I had come back to my business and it was dissolved, that was not the time for me to be looking for a job, try to be charming in an interview, and then learn a new position. I did not have that in me, right? And so life does have interruptions. And so you do need to have something that supports your life, not consume it, right? But the other thing, listen, we had a client that came to us, Christine, and she had been referred to us by a previous client. And I'm not saying this is okay, but it happens. Lots of times, the nature of the people who come to meet with me, their hair's on fire, they're out of control, they're running around, working crazy hours. And sometimes they miss the first appointment. So I'm like, all right, okay, that's why they need me. Let's not judge. Fine. So
Still, hang on, but for our listeners, still very annoying. So
very
not
annoying.
Chris's words, my words. Still
Yeah.
very annoying. Don't do it, guys.
No,
Sorry,
and
go
it
ahead.
does make me think, okay, like you need my help, but I can't help you if you're not going to show up, right? So she missed the second appointment. I'm like, okay, who's the fool? I'm out.
Yeah, yeah,
She begged me,
yeah,
please, Kris, I need your help. So I'm
yeah.
like, all right, I knew the person that referred her, and I thought, okay, fine, I'll do this one time. So
Yeah.
I met with her. Now, here's the thing. She said, I don't know how you're going to help me because what she was doing, she was responsible for helping companies that are $5-10 million large and get their systems ready to sell. So she goes, I'm all
Mm.
about systems. I don't know how you're going to help me. I just have too much work. And I'm like, everyone thinks they have too much work. That's not the case. So here's the thing. We worked with her I have clippings on LinkedIn and my website and stuff, and they're not her giving me a testimony. They're actual clippings from our conversations in session. And she said her income went up 4 times and her hours went down like to 1/5. And she said when she started working with us that she was on all these sleeping things because her adrenaline was so fast and furious and she couldn't sleep and all this craziness. Within the year of working with us, she went to Costa Rica for a month with no Wi-Fi with the VA that we found and trained for her, running the show, came back, everything's beautiful. Business is soaring. She's making a ton more money than she ever did. And she's working like 150 hours.
You know, my friend of mine has a saying, it's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. And I think about your customer's expression of, well, I just don't know how you're going to help me. I think that's it's very common to not be able to see, I don't say so much like the light at the end of the tunnel, because like when you're grinding, you're kind of just hoping for that. But to even imagine that like you could turn your business upside down and make things so much better. And maybe you have an opinion on this. I think also what makes it hard to navigate this kind of optimism on how things could change is there's a lot of noise on social media.
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise and there's a lot of like counteracting advice. Like you can be scrolling through LinkedIn and someone who pops up says, you know, hey, this is above everything else. This is why you need an email list. And then the very next message or the next thing on the algorithm is going to be someone else who has just as many followers, you know, tens of thousands of followers, who says, hey, throw out the email list. You don't want to use it. And so I think as someone if you're working those 16, 17, 18 hours a day throughout your week, I was trying to figure out like how many hours are in a day. But if you're working those long hours and you get like that very brief time to try to like plug in and get some insight, it can be very hard to know what direction to take your business with so much noise.
You're so right, Blake. And here's the thing. There's a couple really important points I want to pull out from there. So one is what happens is whatever your zone of genius is, whatever it is that the clients pay you to do, you started doing that. And then what happens is a little bit of pre-work for that and a little bit of post-work for that. And all of a sudden that starts to swell and you think that's your work, right? But there is always pre and post work. And every single client I've had said, well, no, I have to do this part. I'm like, you have to do this, but they can gather this information from you and you can review it and then you can take it to the next step. You know, quick story. We had a designer that came to work with us and she's like, Kris, you don't understand. I walk into a room. Yes, I've got a designing background, but even somebody else with the same background, mostly she says people have too much furniture in the room. It's all about placement, la, 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 right? So her average session was about 2.5 hours. Well, we broke it down and then we started looking at everything. And a lot of it was pre and post work, paperwork that didn't need to be done with the client, could be done ahead of time, was making it easier for the client. And then when Sue went in to do the work, she's now just focused on the creative part, not doing admin stuff. So her appointments went from 2 to 2.5 hours down to 45 minutes. She started stacking them in the mornings. And now she's this big MC on all these home garden channel, TV network things, doing these live events all over the place that she wouldn't have had the time for before.
Well, and let me pause you there, because I think this is a great example of what I'm referring to of it being hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. So I had a similar conversation like this with a customer of mine. And the details are very similar in the sense of she was also doing a lot of like admin work on the front end. And actually getting more specific, she was a home organizer and she would go do the consult. She would meet with the customer. What she would also do is she would get on Pinterest and she would design out on Pinterest all the things that would go, how the place would be organized. And she was like, I spend like hours doing this. Well, here's a really interesting example for you is, and I'm curious how you navigate this. So in talking with her, I was like, what if you just didn't do the Pinterest anymore? And she's like, I have to do the Pinterest. That's like such an amazing part of my process. Like it means so much to my customers. And I'm sure with your customer, there was probably a part of her that was like, well, these are important things. Like I need to do this. This has to happen. Well, as I pushed on her, it was like, I think what your customers like most is the actual organizing. I don't think it's the Pinterest. It's probably like the organizing piece of it. So a year later, she came back and was like, yeah, I dropped that. And it made zero difference not having it. But at the time, it felt like it was really important. So bringing it back to you, when you have these conversations with people and you identify like these little like, we could really, that's a flag. We can fix that. How do you navigate someone who is so entrenched in their habit? Like, this is how I do my business, which obviously they hired you. There's like a level of like, you're the expert, like hopefully they defer to you. But I'm curious, like, how do you navigate people's habits and like being so routined into how they do things?
So that's a really good point. So what we do is, again, it's sleeves rolled up, hands on. We don't have stuff that we impose upon you. It's very customized to whatever you're working on now. We're going to get you from A to B as fast as you can. And then we're going to get you from B to C even faster. So a couple examples is we're just going to give you relief. So even the first day, if we take 10 minutes off the hour, oh, that's an extra hour at the end of the day. So to your point, what I would have been looking at with your client, Blake, is I would have been saying, you probably don't realize it, but you've been doing these Pinterests for a while. And if they're important to you, what I would say is there is a pattern there. You have a routine. Let's put that, create a simple super toolkit. And I would argue that these images can be pulled, the basic layout can be done. And she may just have to come in and do 2% of it saying, oh, yes, I approve this. I like that one. Yes, here's the kind of, we've got a catalog of hooks that have done well in the past. There is a process that somebody could be prepping all that for her. So let's say it took her an hour to do these Pinterests, she might be down to 10 minutes. So we can systematize it with these powerful super toolkits that are very different than SOPs. So that's a big point to it. I don't have to pull things from their hand. It's like a buffet. I'm going to give you all these options. And if there's seafood, if there's pot roast, you can pick what you want, and then we will work with that.
I think related to this too is sometimes, and this is more, I think smaller businesses struggle with this. Like for our listeners who maybe are newer to entrepreneurship, I think sometimes, and I do think this is most people when they get hired, they want to do a great job.
Yeah.
Like they're running their practice, whatever it is, and they want to deliver, especially if you've come from a background where you weren't making a lot of money and then suddenly someone gives you a lot of money and you're like, oh my gosh, like I have to like do everything for this person now.
Yes.
It's interesting. This not so much like habits and routine, but also like helping people understand like, hey, your area of delivery for this customer is like this right here. And you don't necessarily have to do all these other things. Because I've found that even well-meaning customers will ask for more, like, hey, can you do this for me? Or can you take a look at this? Or can you try this? Or, what have you? And I imagine people getting time back in their day also includes knowing when to say no and probably how to say no without feeling guilty about it.
Yeah. See, again, I'm going to push back. I'm going to say, this is the thing that makes me a little bit teeny crazy, not you, but I'll see this on LinkedIn and be like, you have to set boundaries with your clients. You have to do all these things. It's like, what the hell is that? It's so ambiguous, right? And it's like, okay, I'll set boundaries, but I need this sale this month, or this is a really important client and could leverage me to other people in this industry and blah, 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 right? So what I would say is, what happens with the super toolkits, and when you know how to use your calendar effectively, because 90% of people use it wrong, when you know how to have a team versus dumping some like tasks on people and making them a task puppet, and when you have these super toolkits in play, as your clients ask for more, it doesn't matter because you're constantly getting time back. We do things all the time for our clients that go, oh, they asked for this. Okay, great. Let's systematize it. Let's put it in the super toolkit so everybody gets it because that was a great question. But the super toolkits allow us to be constantly increasing the bandwidth on our calendar. So it's not about learning how to say no. It's learning about how to say yes and do it in a way that everybody gets it. It's efficient and it takes up less time, not more.
But I think you have an area of genius that is like your sweet spot. And you'll have well-meaning customers who aren't necessarily trying to take advantage of you, but they already have you. So like a perfect example would be like, let's say you're a web developer and you built a website for someone. And then someone's like, oh, I love this website and you're so great to work with. Hey, can you do my email marketing campaign?
Yeah.
And you don't know anything about email marketing, but they just paid you $5,000 for a website. And so you're like, Yeah. And it's not even so much about like needing the sale as it is like feeling, and this is why I mentioned like the younger business.
Yeah.
Younger,
Okay. That's a good point.
Younger in business, not necessarily actually age younger, but being younger in business and feeling a bit beholden to like, oh, they just paid me a lot of money. Like, yes, I'll do that. Now you're spending all these hours like Googling how to do email marketing and how does MailChimp work or what have you, instead of sort of like protecting your area of genius, which I think we're talking about two different things.
Yeah, we are. And your point is very valid. So that is a rookie mistake. We've all made it. And so what you need to say is, listen, I want to serve you. I want to do the best I can for you. And that is not my area of expertise. In order to serve you properly, I need to stay in this lane, but I can recommend you to somebody that does email marketing. I guess in my thing, I was thinking about, let's say with our leadership program, let's say you said, oh, Kris, I'm seeing my VA is really doing week to week, it's changing. Can you tell me more about this leadership program? Is there something like, what are they going through right now? And I could say, that's a really good question. I might talk to my team and say, maybe we should have a monthly report card. Okay. All right. Let's add that to the super toolkit. So I can add things on instead of saying, well, you know what? We don't have time to get into that. You're right. They're two different questions.
Well, and I think what I like about what you're saying is it gives you room to innovate and room to like experiment and create and discover. And it's very hard to do those things when you are in survival mode, like working endless hours just to try to make ends meet.
And you know what? Science shows us again and again. And listen, if you're like me, I read all these studies on how the brain works, and the best inventions in the history of humankind were done in times of relaxation and play. You are not creative when you're jumping over hurdles through the day in this constant thing of to get to the next thing. It's not how the brain works. However, I assumed that somehow, because I cared so much about my business, that my brain was exempt from all these studies done at Harvard and Stanford.
That's how it goes, right?
I was a different case.
Yeah.
And I'm here to tell you it's not, right? And so that's the beauty of it, is a lot of my clients will say, oh my gosh, there was just so much noise in my head. And now it's clear thinking all the time. Because I believe you should start the day refreshed and leave fresh. And that you can be as productive at 3:00 in the afternoon as you would be at 10:00 in the morning when it's set up effectively.
I love it. I love it. Kris, we're coming to the end of our time together.
Went so fast.
I told you it would go quick. So I have to imagine there's people listening who are like, holy cow, I just worked like an 80-hour week. I am exhausted. There is no light at the end of the tunnel for me. Like, it's just like, all right, tomorrow's another 16-hour day. And who are really interested. They're like, okay, all right, what's going on here? This sounds like this makes sense. What's the next step for them? How would they connect with you? Like, what would you like them to do to dip their toe into the water of productivity success in connecting with you? What does that look like?
Yeah, tell me that you heard me on this fantastic show. We'll become fast friends. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn for sure. It worked for Blake. It'll work for you. We do have, you can check out at free gift, like I said before, free gift, GIFT from Kris, KRIS.com. I've put some stuff in there, Blake, for your listeners. I put a free audio version of my book. We won't be leaving it up there long, so check that out. But yeah, business should be fun. And I guarantee you, listen, here, if we can end on this, it's really super important. You hear all these stories and the grinding it out and these big industry leaders, and they've done influencers and they were sleeping on their mattress, they were doing all this work. But if you listen to the story, that's the dramatic part of the story. The part where their life and their business turned around was when they crossed the bridge and they started getting help, and they didn't have a to-do list, and they made the transition of using processes. That isn't the exciting, dramatic part of the story. But the drama, what they highlight to get your attention, is the grind. And until you cross that bridge and crawl out of that exhaustion, you're never going to be where you want to be, because if it was hard work, you'd be exactly where you wanted to be by now.
I love that. It's great advice. Kris, it was so great having you on the podcast today. For our listeners, I'll put the link to your LinkedIn profile for people to reach out to you directly. And then also I'm going to put that website, freegiftfromkris.com, in the episode description as well. So, Kris, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for trusting me with your audience.
Of course, of course. For our listeners, don't forget, Kris has a podcast as well, has some amazing guests on that podcast. You want to check that out. I'll also put a link to that in the episode description. And for our listeners, if you're a first-time listener, what the heck are you waiting on? Click the subscribe or follow button so we can keep bringing you good advice wherever you are. Of course, we appreciate all the people who support and promote the podcast, whether that's on our Patreon or the businesses that actually pay for advertising on the podcast. We love you very much. Thanks for supporting the podcast. And that is today's good advice. We'll catch you later. See ya.